Aloha, everybody, and welcome back to another Kaliko Vision. I'm your host, Kaliko Castille. Really excited to have you back because we're going to be talking today about how Hawaii is under the longest illegal occupation in international relations history because they were never actually annexed by the United States and remain under illegal occupation more than 130 years after they were illegally overthrown. Welcome to Kaliko Vision, a podcast devoted to helping you see clearly in the seemingly post-fact era of smoke and mirrors. We'll be interviewing people from all walks of life, each with a unique vision for the future. Now more than ever, it is critical for each of us to harness our strengths and our skill sets to take control of our collective destiny. Strap in and let's see where today's conversation takes us. It's time for another episode of Kaliko Vision.
America, we have come so far. We have seen so much, but there's so much more to do.
What makes this movement unique is we are taking on the corporate establishment. We are taking on the greed of Wall Street.
What are we talking about? We're talking about a hedge fund that serves a bunch of billionaire family offices? Who cares?
It is a movement which says the United States will have health care for all as a human right.
This is our chance to answer that call.
Let them get wiped out. Who cares? They don't get the summer in the Hamptons? Who cares?
Reclaiming my time. Reclaiming my time. Reclaiming my time.
This is about our lives. This is about American lives.
And that shows you what one voice can do. One voice can change a room. And if it can change a room, it can change a city. And if it can change a city, it can change a state. And if it can change a state, it can change a nation. And if it can change a nation, it can change the world.
Welcome back to another edition of Kaliko Vision. Thank you for watching on YouTube or listening on one of the podcast platforms. Wherever you're at, please make sure you're liking and subscribing and leave us a comment or leave us some feedback if you're looking at Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, or here on YouTube. We'll also be putting out some content through our social media at Kaliko Vision Pod. We'd love to hear from you there. Please make sure you're following along as we're going. Like I said, we're going to be talking with Dr. Keanu Sai a little bit later in the show about the history of the Hawaiian Kingdom, the political history of how Hawaii became, and I'm putting in air quotes if you're listening, became part of the United States. People will often point back to an 1898 joint resolution of Congress, but Dr. Keanu Sai, who's one of the leading scholars, in fact, the leading scholar on this particular topic, is going to talk about why under constitutional and international law, Hawaii remains under illegal occupation and is not actually part of the United States, is in fact a separate country under international law and the laws of occupation. So really looking forward to getting into that a little bit later in the show. So stay tuned for that interview. I learn a lot, and I'm sure that you're going to learn a lot as well. But first, I just kind of want to talk about a couple things. Number one, I was at a lunch last week for work, and I was talking to a nonprofit leader who asked the question of some folks who were at the lunch, do you think we're living through authoritarianism? And I had to answer in the affirmative, of course. We are definitely living through authoritarianism under the second Trump administration. And I had made the point that I'm not quite sure that we're going to see the 2026 midterms. That feels weird to say. And maybe I'm being a little bit bombastic, and maybe some people would say that I'm being a little bit, like inflammatory. But, we're actually watching right now. I don't know if you guys have been paying attention, but in Texas, we're watching the Texas legislature try to redistrict in a not a mid-year, but like a midterm, right? Every 10 years, the United States has the United States Census, where we go around and figure out how many people are living in the states. And that's what we use to apportion the number of seats in Congress. And so we do that every 10 years. The last census was done in 2020. The next one will be done in 2030. And so after those, I think they call them bicentennial, right? Every 10 years, bicentennial census. They redraw the districts in each congressional districts in each state. And then, that's kind of the representation out of the 435 members of the House. They're broken up according to the population of each district, right? So those, congressional districts have already been drawn. They were drawn after the 2020 census, but in the state of Texas, they're trying to redraw them in 2025, about halfway to the next election, right? But before the midterms in 2026. So, if I had to question whether we're in authoritarianism, I would say that that's one of the things. There's actually like an objective criteria. Timothy Snyder, who's one of the sort of scholars on fascism or authoritarianism, and others have checklists on, where, the things that happen in the slide to authoritarianism from democracy. And we're checking a lot of the boxes right now. And I would say that the fact that Texas Democrats had to flee the state under threat of being arrested in order to stop the redistricting in Texas is a pretty big deal and pretty anti-democratic. And in response to what's going on in Texas, you got the governor in California, Gavin Newsom, threatening to do the same thing, to call a special session to redraw the districts. And you have several other Democratic-leaning states that have more Republican districts that they could redistrict out if they wanted to gerrymander the state more. And in general, it's leading to this sort of race to the bottom, which I don't see as being a good thing for democracy. But that makes me question, are we going to see a 2026 midterm election? Are we going to see it done in the way that it's supposed to be done is really the question, right? And I know it's like post-2020, it's taboo to question whether, elections are secure and whether they're, free and fair, right? But we often make fun of all of these other countries like Russia, where they have like a figurehead who runs, and I'm putting in quotations, runs for elections, runs for office, but ultimately is just winning in a landslide because, they control the election system. And it seems like we are quickly heading in that direction, where we're all heading to our corners, and similar to how it would have been before the Civil War or before any other sort of big moments in American history. It seems like we are not we're not in a great place right now. And if we're not doing the things we got to do to reform the system, potentially even rebuild the system, we're in for a really long road into authoritarianism. One of the things I was going to bring up, there's this thing called the Project 2025 tracker. I'll link this up in the show notes. If you go to project2025.observer, there's you can choose the different languages. There's actually a tracker, and I'll show it in the edit of this, that shows that they're 46% of the way, almost halfway through getting done with the Project 2025. Everything that was prescribed in the playbook of Project 2025 is nearly complete. 46% says that a total number of objectives being tracked is 317. 34 agencies have objectives. There are still 1,256 days left in the term, but they have managed to do a lot of things. Here's a couple off the top that I'll read that they've already done. So one of the things from Project 2025 is provide robust accommodations for religious employees. So the note here says the Office of Personnel and Management issued a memo that will allow federal workers to promote their religious beliefs to colleagues displaying religious items at work and pray together or individually. And this was completed July 27th, 2025. There was some stories about that recently. Next one was for the CDC, promote fertility awareness-based methods as opposed to contraception for family planning. Note, the administration is rerouting birth control funds to menstrual cycle education classes to try to prevent pregnancy without using birth control. So just time it. You're good. Don't worry about safe sex. Just time it. Right. Basically, a more well thought out pull-out method is basically what the CDC is now working towards. So you guys should check that out. I'll link it up in the show notes, but that's one of the examples, Project 2025 being the roadmap that the Heritage Foundation laid out for the slide from democracy to authoritarianism. Well, they're 46% of the way done, and we're only 8 months midway through 8 months into this just disastrous presidency. Another example of some authoritarianism that people may or may not be aware of, but you've been seeing all this information about ICE and seeing all the sort of headlines about ICE raids. But did you know that ICE just recently got a 265% increase in their annual budget in this latest House resolution that funded the government? And that current ICE budget, Immigration Custom Enforcement budget, is 62% larger than the entire federal prison budget? Yeah. So we basically have Trump's own secret police now being more well-funded than the entire federal prison system. And there's another article here from the independent.com. ICE is now richer than most of the world's militaries thanks to Trump's new funding. ICE's annual budget increase from $8.7 billion to $27.7 billion puts them higher than the military spending, the annual military budgets of Iran, Turkey, Spain, Mexico, and at least 23 of the top 40 military spenders. That's crazy. So during the RNC last summer, when you saw all of the signs for mass deportations now, this is how they're doing it. Even though Trump was out here saying that he was going to focus on the criminals, I saw Senator Alex Padilla say this and some others are echoing it, but no, they're showing up to court hearings where they say they're going after criminals, but people are showing up for court cases and they're showing up there to arrest them. They're showing up to workplaces. They say these people don't work and they're lazy and here just taking public dollars, but they're showing up to workplaces to raid them. Right. So they aren't going after the criminals and the dangerous ones as they sort of have always framed it. They're just using it as a way to go after people with brown skin or who they deem as like not belonging here, right? As not being American. Which, of course, there's been conversations about dismantling the, birthright citizenship, right? The idea that if you're born on American soil, you are an American. That's like the underpinnings of a lot of constitutional law. It traces its way back to a Supreme Court case where a man from China who became a U.S. resident and U.S. citizen was able to sue for, I guess he was actually born here, to have birthright citizenship. So that's been around since the late 1800s. We're seeing the dissolving of checks and balances, right? We had the presidential immunity ruling last summer from the Supreme Court where they basically said if you did anything as president in your official capacity as president, it couldn't be deemed illegal, which he's now using to basically federalize the takeover of D.C. If you've been paying attention just this week, Donald Trump is basically bringing National Guard troops into Washington, D.C. He's saying to crack down on crime at a time when D.C. has a historically low crime rate that has been dropping steadily. Yeah, he's using it as a way to bring the National Guard in at a time when he's fighting court cases over bringing National Guard troops and federal troops into L.A. and into California. And, California's pushing back on that being illegal, but he's trying to do that in D.C. as well, right? We just saw the firing of the director of the Bureau of Labor Statistics because he didn't like the jobs report that came out. And he replaced that person with someone who actually helped write Project 2025 and worked at the Heritage Foundation. And this person then floated the idea of actually just stopping monthly jobs reports. I'd seen this TikTok from an investor who was like, that's fucking crazy. Like, that's how I make my plans on how I'm going to invest, is to understand the fundamentals of the economy. And one of those is what the monthly jobs report is. And the idea that it's not politicized, that it's just the best information that the Bureau of Labor Statistics have. Right. And the Trump administration basically says, well, they had to review and revise their numbers too often and by too large a margin. But that's kind of like how it's always been done, is When you got additional information, you updated the numbers, right? They had like their best guess, the best sort of like projection, and then they would update that when they got the actual numbers, right? But this continues to sort of show that like Trump, whatever Trump says is the truth, right? There was an article from the Wall Street Journal that said that he's trying to basically take over all of the programming for the Smithsonian, and it has to be sort of pre-approved by him, the history that's pre-approved by him, right? This is what happens in fascist countries. This is what happens in authoritarian countries. This is what happens in places that we used to think were anti-American, anti-democratic. But it's happening here, and it's happening with our current president, who continues to be supported by millions of people who don't understand the Constitution and don't understand what it is to be an American. But I would say those are just a few examples of the way in which we are absolutely living through an authoritarian moment here in the United States, and we all need to be doing something about it. Sure, yes, you should be calling your representatives, calling your members of Congress, your state reps, telling them to speak up, right? Telling them to protect democracy, to protect the right to vote, to protect the things that are fundamental to what make us American. Absolutely should be doing that. And you should be figuring out, what can you alone do? Everybody should be reaching out to their representative. But what can you do right now? Maybe it's just doing something locally, right? Maybe it's just a local gathering. Maybe it's just going door to door and checking in on people and seeing how they're doing, right? Maybe it's building a phone tree and just checking in on people. But we are absolutely living through authoritarianism, and what we need to do now, our job, is to build the foundation for what comes after. We are watching the crumbling of the American empire, and all of our institutions are crumbling to the ground. It is going to be on us to relay the foundation. So I look forward to that work. It's going to continue to be hard times, but I look forward to continuing to have this space to talk about it with you and to talk about what I think are some of the most important things that are going on. But we are absolutely living through American authoritarianism, and it is on us to fight back and to remind people what it is that make us Americans in the first place, and why so many people would leave countries from distant shores to come here to live the American dream, right? And I think, in the words of George Carlin, maybe it's the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it. But I think that we can truly make this a place where we can all be proud of. And I look forward to doing that with all of you. But I got one more thing that I want to make sure I cover here before we jump into today's interview with Dr. Keanu Sai, which is a mind-blowing interview. And the last thing I want to talk about is Gaza. And I'm sorry that these are all just heavy things, but these are heavy times. And I shouldn't even be smiling. But if you're not smiling, you're crying, right? Just this week, Israel murdered, I believe it was 4 Al Jazeera journalists, one of which was Anas Al-Sharif, who was a very well-known, had millions of followers on like Instagram and throughout his social platforms, well-known Al Jazeera reporter, who was killed when he was in a tent with some other reporters just outside one of the hospitals. And this makes it's well over 190 journalists who have been killed over the last 2 years by Israel. And that is a war crime. We're going to talk a little bit about war crimes later on in this episode about as it relates to Hawaii. But there are so many going on in Palestine and in Gaza right now. And I think it's really important to remember that there are no statutes of limitations on war crimes. We're watching so many of them being televised right in front of our eyes. And Anas was somebody who was targeted because he was telling the truth about what was on the ground. One of the few people was getting it out to major platforms. And I just want to read real quick his last will and testament that I think was something we should all be thinking about and trying to figure out how we can continue the memory of so many who have perished over the last 2 years, but specifically the people like Anas who are bringing light to the darkness in these moments. He says, "This is my will and final message. If these words reach you, know that Israel has succeeded in killing me and silencing my voice. First, peace be upon you and Allah's mercy and blessings. Allah knows I gave every effort and all my strength to be a support and a voice for my people. Ever since I opened my eyes to life in the alleys and streets of the Jabalia refugee camp, my hope was that Allah would extend my life so that I could return to my family and loved ones to our original town of occupied Ascalon, Al-Majdal. But Allah's will came first, and his decree is final. I have lived through pain in all its details, tasted suffering, and lost many times. Yet I never once hesitated to convey the truth as it is, without distortion or falsification, so that Allah may bear witness against those who stayed silent, those accepted our killing, and those who choked our breath, and whose hearts were unmoved by the scattered remains of our children and women, and doing nothing to stop the massacre that our people have faced for more than a year and a half. I entrust you with Palestine, the jewel in the crown of the Muslim world, the heartbeat of every free person in this world. I entrust you with its people, with its wronged and innocent children, who never had the time to dream or live in the safety and peace. Their pure bodies were crushed under thousands of tons of Israeli bombs and missiles, torn apart and scattered across the walls. I urge you not to let chains silence you, nor borders restrain you. Be bridges towards the liberation of the land and its people until the sun of dignity and the freedom rises over our stolen homeland. I entrust you to take care of my family. I entrust you to take care of my beloved daughter Sham, the light of my eyes, whom I never got the chance to watch grow up as I had dreamed. I entrust you with my dear son Salah, whom I had wished to support and accompany through life until he grew strong enough to carry my burden and continue the mission. I entrust you with my beloved mother, whose blessed prayers brought me to where I am, whose supplications were my fortress, and whose light guided my path. I pray that Allah grants her strength and rewards her on my behalf with the best of rewards. I also entrust you with my lifelong companion, my beloved wife Salah Bayan, from whom the war separated me for many long days and months. Yet she remained faithful to our bond, steadfast as the trunk of an olive tree that does not bend, patient, trusting in Allah, and carrying the responsibility in my absence with all her strength and faith. I urge you to stand by them, to be their support after Allah Almighty. If I die steadfast upon my principles. I testify before Allah that I am content with his decree, certain of meeting him, and assured what is with Allah is better and everlasting. O Allah, accept me among the martyrs, forgive my past and future sins, and make my blood a light that illuminates the path of freedom for my people and my family. Forgive me if I have fallen short, and pray for me with mercy, for I kept my promise and never changed or betrayed it. Do not forget Gaza, and do not forget me in your sincere prayers for forgiveness and acceptance. Anas Al-Sharif. It is incredible that we are on, as I'm recording this, on day 676 of the war in Palestine and Gaza. And we have seen 60,000 plus people documented who have been killed needlessly in this genocide against the Palestinian people. And yes, of course, October 7th was horrendous and should be condemned. And that's the easy part. Everyone is against the idea that Hamas murdered a lot of innocent people. But where is the outrage for the more than 40 times as many people who died on October 7th who continue to perish, and the millions of people who are now under threat of famine and forced starvation on behalf of Israel? So right now you see the international community is starting to just potentially say fuck you to Israel, which I believe is what should be happening. And they're actually threatening to recognize Palestine if we don't see humanitarian aid getting in there, food getting in, and a ceasefire happening. So Australia is recognizing, threatening to recognize Palestine at the next meeting of the UN in September. You got former Secretary of State Antony Blinken coming out and saying he thinks it's too hasty, that sure, like morally it's the right thing to do to recognize Palestine, but maybe it's just a little too hasty. We should still require the hostages to be freed before we do that. Even as people are literally starving. Even as Israel continues to commit war crimes by murdering journalists. Another couple things I wanted to mention on the Gaza front. There was a interview done by Breaking Point's by Sagar Anjeti and Crystal Ball a few weeks ago with a whistleblower from GHF, which was the organization in charge of doing the humanitarian aid in Gaza. And he tells this story of a little boy who didn't even get like an actual shipment, like a big bag of flour, but had been scraping together some stuff off the ground, had come up to kiss his hand and to say thank you. He said thank you in English. And then he ended up running off, got caught in a crowd where the people who were running the aid distribution point were firing at them. They were told to fire at them as like warning shots, like at their feet to keep them moving. And this little boy who just minutes earlier was having this like heartbreaking exchange with this, former special forces soldier, went from being thankful to being killed. And this is something that's happening all the time. There's been over 100 people killed at aid sites over the last couple of months since they finally started letting more food in, but barely any. Now, 2 Israeli human rights groups are calling it a genocide, finally. There's an article I'm going to link up in the show notes from Jacobin that talks about how we're watching the disintegration of international law. And really the rule of law, period, right? The Trump administration here domestically is, he's president today, even after being convicted of felonies and having many more he was to stand trial for. But the election as president saved him, right? And now we're watching him go rough, just crazy with corruption and breaking any rule he wants to, because the Supreme Court said as long as he's president, he can do it. So we're watching the disintegration of the rule of law here in the United States as we watch the takeover of an authoritarian government. And we're watching the disintegration of an international law as Israel continues to do whatever the fuck it wants, because it's basically running the U.S.'s playbook from the Iraq War, where we decided we were going to unilaterally strike a country that did not pose a threat to us. We were going to tell the international community, you're either with us or you're against us, and we're going to just do what we want to do, right? And Benjamin Netanyahu watched George W. Bush do that. He watched continuously as the war on terror overseas continued to be extended through the authorization for the use of military force, which we even wrote blank checks for Barack Obama with drone strikes overseas. But we are watching right now like the disintegration of the new world order that was set up after World War II. When we set up the UN, we set up NATO, we set up these institutions, these intergovernmental organizations, as we'll talk about a little bit later in this interview, that really like stood to be a bulwark against strongmen, against people who didn't care what the rules of the road were, and the idea that we all should be playing by the same rules. And so what's happening in Gaza is not only about Gaza, right? So there's a lot of people that like, because this isn't an issue that feels like it matters to them because they're not Jewish or they're not Palestinian or they don't care about foreign policy issues. Like, this is about the idea that we all play by the same rules, and that like it is not just power that determines what's right, right? It's not might makes right. And it's not the idea of peace through strength. It's the idea of strength through peace. So, I'll have more to say on that at some other point, but I just really wanted to make sure that I highlighted Anas's final will, because it was disgusting what happened to him and some other Al Jazeera journalists this week, and the continued war crimes that are being committed by Israel as we all just sit back and act like there's nothing we can do, even though American tax dollars are continuing to fund it. And my current Congresswoman, Janelle Bynum, remains absolutely silent. Just derelict in her duty, just absolutely silent. And then one of my senators, Ron Wyden, decided not to vote to stop military aid to Israel, even as they're forcing the starvation of millions of people in Palestine. It's truly disgusting, some of the time that we're living in, and the inability and unwillingness of people who are in power, who are actually elected by us, to just sit on their hands and act like they can't do anything. All right, I want to go ahead and kick it off to our interview here. If you've stuck around this long, I really appreciate it. But this interview that I got lined up here in just a second with Dr. Keanu Sai is one that I've been truly preparing for the last 15 years, since I've found out about this idea that Hawaii was under illegal occupation under international and constitutional law. We just got done talking about the disintegration of the rule of law, both domestically and internationally. And we're going to talk about this case that, the U.S. Marines overthrew the Queen of Hawaii in 1893. 2 treaties of annexation were killed. They only went with a joint resolution. So we're going to talk about sort of the uncovering Hawaii's hidden history, talking a little bit about how Dr. Keanu Sai proved this idea about illegal occupation at the University of Hawaii, as well as internationally at the Permanent Court of Arbitration, sort of some of the glossary terms around international law and domestic law. A really awesome chapter that he wrote with Oxford Press, University Press, for this book called Unconquered States, where he talks about the history of Hawaii really withstanding this era of colonization where all of the great European powers had colonized across the globe. But Hawaii was one of the few countries that managed to withstand that. And even to today, you'll understand why after the interview, even today maintains its independence despite its illegal occupation from Hawaii and its ability to not have ever been colonized by a European power. So a lot of really awesome, really cool, interesting nuggets from Dr. Keanu Sai, as well as we're going to talk a little bit about Chief of War, which we talked about on the last interview or last episode briefly. He's going to talk a little bit about this sort of like connection between the timeline that's happening in the new Apple TV series, Chief of War, and then what he talks about on the Hawaiian Kingdom side and all of that political history. So really excited and really appreciate you guys tuning in for another episode of Kaliko Vision. I hope you enjoyed this interview with Dr. Keanu Sai. I'm sure you're going to learn a little something, and look forward to hearing from you guys on the socials. And like I said before, make sure you're liking, subscribing on any of the Apple, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, or YouTube Podcasts. Wherever you listen to podcasts, on whatever platform, make sure you're liking, subscribing, and give us a little feedback. Let us know how we're doing, and let us know what you would like to hear and who you'd like to hear us interview. But once again, thank you for listening to Kaliko Vision. I'm your host, Kaliko Castille, and we'll see you on the other side of this really awesome interview with Dr. Keanu Sai. Aloha and welcome back to another Kaliko Vision. I'm your host, Kaliko Castille. Really appreciate you guys joining us, and I'm so excited about today's interview with Dr. Keanu Sai, who happens to be, full disclosure, a cousin of mine and a member of my ohana, but is a political scientist, an international law scholar whose groundbreaking work frames the Hawaiian Kingdom not as a relic in history, but as a sovereign state under continuous occupation. And I'm really excited to talk to him today. I've been following his work for 15 years, and I will get into it here in a little bit. But, part of this is really kind of talking about this legal subject, this sort of area of law that doesn't get a lot of attention here in the United States, but it's this idea that the United States has been illegally occupying Hawaii, or the Hawaiian Kingdom, since 1898, after an illegal overthrow in 1893. So Dr. Keanu Sai is one of the leading scholars, if not the leading scholar, on this particular topic. Was the very first dissertation I ever read in my life was his PhD dissertation that he had put in at UH Manoa when he got his PhD back in 2008. And I actually came to this subject in sort of a weird way, but my dad was adopted. We found out in 2010 who our family was, right? Where that connection led to. And my tutu, my grandma, came out to visit my dad and I and the family in Medisol, and we were at my sister's hula gig, and we were just chatting, and she knew that I was a cannabis activist and really active in politics here in Oregon. And she said, "Hey, your dad tells me you're an activist. Well, one of your cousins is an activist too." She said, "Have you ever heard about Hawaiian sovereignty?" And I was like, "What?" Like, that was the first time I'd ever heard of the concept Hawaiian sovereignty. I was going to school at Western Oregon University at the time. So that next week when I went back to school, I went down a rabbit hole that I got sent into that I didn't even expect to go into after my tutu had mentioned this idea of Hawaiian sovereignty and me needing to understand who my cousin Keanu was. And so I went down that rabbit hole. Here I am 15 years later, really excited to have this conversation. But I know Keanu, who's about to step on here, also had his sort of rabbit hole journey that came from his tutu, and I look forward to talking a little bit about that as well. Keanu, I really appreciate you joining us today, and looking forward to having this conversation. But thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Well, I just obviously talked about sort of how I first learned about this concept, which has now blown my brain, and now I'm like learning and kind of relearning a bunch of things that I thought I knew growing up. And one of those is this idea that Hawaii is not actually part of the United States. That Hawaii, under constitutional and international law, is in fact an independent country just under illegal occupation. Now in 2025, that would make it the longest occupation in international relations history, even longer than that's going on in Palestine by Israel right now. But can you tell us a little bit about how did you discover this concept, and how did you start to sort of uncover the history behind Hawaii and how its independence still remains, even well over 100 years later?
Yeah, well, so I'm the oldest grandchild on my mom's side of the family. That's the Reeves Ohana. So Keanu Reeves, the movie actor, is actually my cousin, and we all come from a valley called Kuli'o'o. So Keanu Reeves' dad, Uncle Sam, and my mom are first cousins. So in this valley, you had 9 acres, and each acre was given to my papa and his brothers and sisters, 9 of them. And then in each acre, they subdivided it into quarter acre. That's how my mom was able to get a quarter acre, a piece of land. And then further subdividing into what is called in Hawaii, Ohana zoning, right? So my tutu lived in the back house, right? And I would always visit her. And she pretty much raised me along with my parents. And being the oldest grandchild in Hawaiian culture, they normally are always the alaka'i, or the favorite, right? So that was my relationship I had with my tutu. After I graduated from the Kamehameha schools in 1982, I went on to a military college, New Mexico Military Institute, where I'm going to get my associate's degree in pre-business in 1984, as well as a commission as a second lieutenant in a program of ROTC called the Early Commissioning Program. That's where they put 4 years of military science and they compressed it into 2 years because they needed officers, right? So that's where I was back then in 1984. So before I was about to graduate, I received a call from my mom and says my tutu got cancer and that she's in hospice, which is a room that was converted next door, my Uncle Hank's house, for my tutu, hospital bed and everything. And she told my mom to let me know that she's not going to die until I come home. So after I graduated, I came home, and all my tutu wanted me to do was just sit down and talk story with her, or more like she was talking to me. I was just listening, right? And she wouldn't allow no one else in the room. She made sure I closed the door. So my uncles and aunties and my mom were outside. And after every session with my tutu, I come out, they all ask me, what did mom say? And that's what was going on for, I think, about maybe a couple of months, right? Now, she was sharing with me a lot of stories, but one particular story that really stood out for me that I've shared in other presentations was my tutu was talking about a situation where Uncle Pineko, who I knew as an older uncle, always visiting, was disciplined, right? Heavily disciplined. Locally, we say he got spankings. And I believe he was around 8 years old, or around 8 years old. And my tutu was very sad, she was telling me, because of that. Because she said that he didn't properly bow to the prince who was in the house. And I said, wait a minute, tutu, Prince who? And she said, Prince Kuhio. And I was just taken aback because Prince Kuhio is a real prince from King Kaliko's dynasty, right? So he was an heir to the throne, where Lili Okalani was an heir apparent to the throne, right? So he was part of that dynasty. And he was also representing Hawaii in the Congress, in the House of Representatives, right? So I asked him, what is Prince Kuhio doing in the house? And she said, oh, he's good friends with my dad. I was like, what? Now I heard none of this stuff growing up with my tutu, right? None of it. And before she passed, she made me promise her that I would know my genealogy. That's what she said. And she said, when you know your genealogy, you will know who you are and what you need to do. Something simple. I said, sure, I will. And she later passed. Now, I didn't take her up on that until 1992. This is 1984, because my focus was fulfilling my military career, where I had to serve 3 years active duty, 3 years reserve, which was my contract that I signed at New Mexico Military Institute. So I began serving my time in the reserves when I came back home in 1984 by joining the 1st of the 487 Field Artillery. And then I went on both active and reserve. And I finished off in 1994, where I was honorably discharged, right? So in 1992, I realized that I didn't follow through with my tutu's order, not request. In Hawaiian, we call that kawoha, right? And I said, I got to know my genealogy. So I was able to find that genealogy in a newspaper that was published in the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1896. And it was in a newspaper called Kamaka'i Nana. And the title of it was Mo'oku Hawali'i, or Genealogy of Nobility. And throughout that year of 1896, all the genealogies of nobles were published. And this genealogy that I found, which I also found on my dad's side of the family, so that's your side, and it, on my dad's side, it started off with Pi'ilani from the 15th century, very well-known king and of Maui. And it went to my great-great-grandmother, Julia, which would be your great-great-great-grandmother, right? In 1896. On my mom's genealogy, it started off in the 15th century with King Liloa from Hawaii Island. And it went down to my great-grandfather and his brother and sister. And his name was William Kuakini Samerson in 1896. So I believe he was 16 years old at that time. One thing I noticed in that genealogy, because I wanted to know who these people were, was one person that stood out for me was a person named Kanaina Nui. And Kanaina Nui, who is my fourth great-grandfather, was actually the one who killed Captain Cook after Captain Cook made that bad decision of trying to take King Kalaniʻopuʻu hostage, right? That was just a bad decision. So when I began to look at who these people were, I was blown away, you know. And then I naturally get into the Hawaiian Kingdom as a country. And as an officer at that time, I was a captain. As an officer, I'm gathering intel. But the type of intel I'm gathering is not newspaper articles or opinions. I want to find government documents that can explain things, right? You know, minutes of the Privy Council. I want to see what they're saying, right? Minutes of the Legislative Assembly, okay? The laws, the Constitution. And I quickly began to realize that the Hawaiian Kingdom, as it was being taught in the schools And what I learned at the Kamehameha schools, as well as at the University of Hawaii, was all wrong. It always portrayed the Hawaiian Kingdom as if it was controlled by the foreigner, the American missionary. Nothing can be further from the truth, right? Now, after 1893, it wasn't the missionaries that seized control, but rather insurgents that were propped up by the U.S. ambassador assigned to Hawaii. Okay, so naturally I get into 1893, and I came across what was called the Blunt Reports. And this was a report by a special commissioner appointed by President Cleveland on March 9th, 1893, to investigate the overthrow of the Hawaiian government that occurred the previous January, of 1893. So as I began to read those reports that he was sending periodically to the Secretary of State, Walter Gresham, I began to see things in a very different way, right? And then I was able to read the report, the dispatch from the dispatch from Secretary of State Gresham to President Cleveland on October 18th, 1893, that summarizes the investigation. And it concludes the United States was in the wrong, and that the Hawaiian Kingdom, the Queen, yielded her authority under threat of war, physical war, right? And that prompted President Cleveland on December 18th to deliver a message to the United States Congress. And in that speech, or that written statement to the Congress, he laid out what happened, that what occurred in 1893 was illegal because it said the provisional government, which are these insurgents, owes its existence to an armed invasion by the United States. Very specific. Also, he said that the U.S. Marines that landed in Honolulu was an invasion, and that it was an act of war. Now, from an Army standpoint, because back then that's all I had. I wasn't a political scientist. My bachelor's degree was in sociology, but I was fully trained as an Army officer. And in the Army regulations, it covers the laws of war, also the law of occupation, and the responsibility of an invader who overthrows the government to establish a temporary government called a military government, which is the civilian government of the occupied state, to continue to administer the laws until a treaty of peace comes into effect, where the occupation will end. Okay, so that we knew. I knew that in the Army. So that's when I began to realize, wait a minute, what happened in 1893 by an act of war was the overthrow of our government, not the country. See, in Army Regulations, FM 27-10, Field Manual 27-10, it specifically says that, as a result of war, the overthrow of a government does not transfer sovereignty to the occupant, only the temporary authority to administer the laws of the occupied state until there's a treaty of peace. That is specifically an Army regulation. And that's when I went, whoa, this is no different than what happened in Kuwait. So when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, see, at that time in 1990, I was at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, going through officers advanced course as a captain. Okay. And our job, not our job, we were being trained in how to be a part of a staff, but also battle planning. So we're getting live intel coming in from Kuwait, and based upon that intel, we were developing battle plans, because at any time, any of us could have been activated, especially field artillery, right? And we all knew that even though Saddam Hussein with the Republican Guard overthrew the Kuwaiti government and drove them into exile, into Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait was still Kuwait. It was called occupied. And Saddam Hussein was supposed to administer Kuwaiti law. Instead, what he did, 1 week after the invasion, declared by Iraqi law from Baghdad that Kuwait was annexed, right? And we knew that has no effect in occupied territory because that is Iraqi law. You're supposed to be administering Kuwaiti law, because sovereignty of Kuwait still existed, that would prevent the imposition of any law within its territory without its consent. So that then brought me to the conclusion that in 1898, when the United States Congress passed a law at the height of the Spanish-American War to annex Hawaii, my quick reaction was looking at what happened to Kuwait. I went, wow, Hawaiian Kingdom still exists. And President Cleveland committed with the Queen in an agreement called a treaty on the international law that she was going to be restored as the head of the government. And that didn't happen. So what happened in the Hawaiian Kingdom was the only removal of government officials was the Queen and her cabinet and Marshal Charles Wilson, who was head of the police force. Everyone in government were told to stay in place and sign oaths of allegiance to the new regime, who were being protected by U.S. Marines. So what you have there in 1893 was not an overthrow of a government, but rather a illegal takeover of a government. Similar situation to a plane being hijacked. All that was replaced were the pilots. Everyone else stayed in place.
It's a really interesting nuance about the it wasn't an overthrow of the government, but a takeover of the government, because the government essentially stayed in place. All of the functions of the government continued to run, but the people who were actually at the head of it were different because they were moved out. That's super interesting sort of nuance there. I'm curious, like, obviously I want to talk a little bit about like how you went back to get your master's, how you got your PhD, how you started to prove this to people, right? Like, actually, as you said, you started with sort of government documents, talking about the Blount report. And for anyone listening, I'm going to be putting into the show notes some first primary source documents that are coming from Keanu that he's unearthed through some of this research. And one of it is like it's a multi-page document from this, high, well-respected congressman who was part of the Foreign Relations Committee, who was sent out to Hawaii for several months to do this research and to do a bunch of interviews to figure out what actually happened during that overthrow in 1893. And the conclusion that he came to was that it was illegal and that the U.S. needed to restore the kingdom government. And so in that, they actually submitted back to back to Cleveland. Cleveland gave that back to Congress saying, here's sort of what the report is. This is what the state of affairs is. But the kingdom government was never restored. So can you first, let's start off with kind of like talking a little bit about how you started to prove this, both, at the University of Hawaii and then on the international stage. But then also, can you talk a little bit about kind of that aspect of when you started to find these primary source documents, that kind of helped to lead to, it wasn't about sort of people's feelings about a thing, but there was actually sort of like cut and dry definitions under international and constitutional law that made this a kind of an open and shut case.
Well, I have to stress that my approach to this situation was based upon my training as an Army officer and my experience, right? And from the intel that I was gathering, it was undeniable. But I quickly came to realize that I was in the wrong army. And that was hard hitting for me to a point where, wow, something I couldn't deny. I even had a meeting before I put in my papers with my battalion commander, Colonel Carpenter. And when I explained to him the situation that I've uncovered and that I need to put in my papers to retire as a captain, he totally understood. So I didn't leave because I was angry. I just left because I needed to go to another chapter in my life, right? So I was honorably discharged, right? And so I'm a veteran. Nothing wrong with that. Okay? Good training. But now I'm going to apply that to Hawaii situation. So the one thing that we did in the Army as officers is when you come up with a battle plan, you have to have what is called an estimate process. We call it the command estimate process. And what you do is you gather intel. Gather intel with a particular mission. This mission that I came to was we had to deal with an enemy. We call them OP4, opposing force. And this enemy in Hawaii situation today was ignorance. Nobody knew anything, right? We were brainwashed into believing something that's not true. Okay, so when I saw it from that angle, and I could actually trace where that brainwashing started, it was a formal policy by the United States through its Territorial Hawaii Board of Education in 1906 called Americanization through denationalization. And this was a policy applied in all public and private schools, which my tutu, this is her generation, was a student, a young student. And they were led to believe that Hawaii is the United States, that they are Americans, all they learned was American history, and to speak English and not the national language of Hawaiian. Okay. Now, that right there, called denationalization, the United States recognizes that as a war crime since World War I, okay, the First World War. They're accusing the Germans, the Bulgarians, and the Austrians of committing denationalization, that war crime, against the people of the Kingdom of Serbia during the occupation, right? So let's be clear, the United States knows that's a war crime. They implemented that war crime. And denationalization, by definition under international law, is to obliterate the national consciousness in the minds of school children. Okay. Here, that obliteration of national consciousness occurred with my tutu. By the time it got to my parents, it's already been institutionalized. By the time it got to me, out of sight, out of mind, I didn't know anything about it. And that pretty much reflects why our approach toward ignorance and to expose the Hawaiian Kingdom and its continued existence is dealing with that ignorance, right? So it's a different type of warfare, okay? So the mission is to bring compliance to the law of occupation, not to restore the sovereignty. The sovereignty never left, right? So there was a movement locally here called the sovereignty movement, but that was operating on a false premise that Hawaii lost its sovereignty. No, still had it. So we came up with a strategic plan and how we're going to approach this. This is not about trying to convince everybody. We're going to move in an affirmative approach, not reactive, right? So one thing that we learned in the Army is how you respond to a crisis as opposed to reacting to a crisis. So here's the difference. Let's say you have an active shooter on campus, right? You have those that react to the crisis, run away, safety, that's normal. That's a normal behavior. Then you have those that respond to the crisis, first responders. What they do is they walk to the crisis. That's not normal. You got to have training, right? So in the Army, when you hear gunfire, you go toward the gunfire. You don't run from it. So we knew that our approach has to be very affirmative toward the gunfire, toward the ignorance. And we came up with a strategic plan of 3 phases. Phase 1, verification that the Hawaiian Kingdom continues to exist as an independent state. We needed that verification by some international body, reputable body, internationally reputable. Once we get recognition that the Hawaiian Kingdom continues to exist, then we move to phase 2, exposure. And that's exposure of Hawaiian statehood, economically, politically, legally, through education. And this exposure phase is going to get very uncomfortable for people because it runs counter to what they knew, right? And then within that phase 2 will naturally be the movement toward compliance to the law of occupation, where the state of Hawaii, who is in effective control of over 19,000 square miles, as opposed to the federal government and the federal troops here that are only in effective control of less than 500 square miles, the law of occupation under Army regulations required that the state of Hawaii, which was the hijacked government of the Hawaiian Kingdom, must transform itself into a military government to begin to administer the laws of the occupied state in order for the occupation to come to an end, which is phase 3. Okay, so those are the three phases. That's how we're going to approach it. Phase one, accomplished. Permanent Court of Arbitration in 1999 verified the Hawaiian Kingdom continues to exist as an independent state. Now, this stems from a dispute between Lance Larson, a Hawaiian subject, and the Council of Regency, who he was alleging is liable for allowing American laws to be imposed in Hawaii that led to his unfair trial and subsequent incarceration. So that was the argument of his attorney. So we entered into an agreement with them, with the attorney on behalf of Lance Larson, to go to binding arbitration at the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Now, I'm the chairman of the Council of Regency, and I knew that we can achieve phase one at the Permanent Court of Arbitration because the Permanent Court of Arbitration resolves international disputes. So all the countries, which currently, I believe, 125 of them were also members of the UN, they formed that court in 1899, okay, to resolve international disputes. So if they have a dispute, they have access to the facilities at no cost because they maintain the facilities through annual contributions that they got to provide. But Article 47 of that treaty that established that court allows non-contracting states to have access, but they got to pay for the use of the facilities. We knew that when the dispute was submitted, arbitration agreement was submitted by Lance Larson's attorney, the first thing that the Permanent Court of Arbitration would have to do is to determine whether or not the Hawaiian Kingdom is a state, an existing state, and does it have a government, and then determine whether or not it is a contracting state or a non-contracting state. They verified that fact that the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists and the Council of Regency is its government.
Can we take a quick pause there? Because I know a lot of folks who are listening probably aren't folks who went to school for international relations or understand maybe even the basic sort of like underpinnings of international law. But can you explain a little bit about what a state under international law is versus a state under U.S. domestic law? A lot of people, when they hear Hawaii is a state, they're still thinking it's a state under the 50 United States. Can you kind of explain what that means under international law and why it's so significant that the Permanent Court of Arbitration took that hearing and sort of confirmed the Hawaiian Kingdom's status as a state?
Okay, so at the international level, it's actually called an independent state, but they say state. So it's already assumed at the international level, an independent state is a state and a state is an independent state, right? But for the sake of definitions, okay, so an independent state, right, which is the United States today, is a country that has a defined border, people in it, centralized government, and the ability to enter into foreign relations with other independent states. So you have four qualifications that has to be met, right? Now, in the case of Palestine, the reason why they're not recognized as an independent state universally is because they have a government, they have people, they have the ability to enter into foreign relations because they're an observer state at the United Nations. What they don't have is the territory. And that is that missing component that they refer to as the two-state option. They're referring to the territory. What actually is the territory? So an independent state has no question. Now, an independent state that is called a federation, right? That is comprised of states that are not independent, right? Meaning they have a centralized government, people in it, okay? But what they don't have is and the territory, and what they don't have is the ability to enter into foreign relations. That is given to the United States as an independent state, okay? And then in the United States, you have what is called within the states themselves, the federated states, are nations. And these are nations of people, in this case, tribal nations, Native Americans, that exist within a state or states of the United States, right? So let's look at New York, okay? A lot of people may not know this, but when the revolution ended in 1783, King George III recognized the 13 former British colonies as 13 independent states in a confederation, which is a loose union like the European Union. You can still be an independent state, but in a confederation. In 1789, that confederation changed into a federation. And that is when the 13 independent states created the federal government, thereby having what is called residual sovereignty, but giving the independence to the United States as a federated state, right? So that's what you have today. So the Hawaiian Kingdom was recognized as an independent state in 1843 by Great Britain. Prior to that, the Hawaiian Kingdom was a British protectorate since 1794. That's why you have the Union Jack on the flag here in Hawaii. It reflects that relationship that Hawaii had with the British. So that's what a state and an independent state is, and a nation.
I appreciate that. I know recently there was a book that was put out called Unconquered States, which focuses on nations or states that had not been subjected or not succumbed to sort of European colonization. And one of the chapters in that book you had contributed sort of talked about the Hawaiian history and how it was able to set itself up to be an unconquered state, right? Even under illegal occupation, still not succumbing to sort of the colonizing, which the colonies, which a lot of people will talk about when they're talking about Hawaii. They'll say like the colonizers came, right? But can you talk a little bit about sort of what your chapter focused on? And then I heard you just talk about sort of the Union Jack in the Hawaiian Kingdom flag, and sort of like a lot of people see that and they also see the stripes and think, oh, maybe that comes from the United States. But can you explain a little bit about sort of that era, about the 1840s when they were getting their recognition from Great Britain, France, and then the United States, and then also just kind of that history of really Hawaii's very concerted effort to have diplomatic relations with the great powers at that time?
So the recent publication of the book Unconquered States by Oxford University Press is very significant, because this book is about countries of the 19th century that became independent states and then were never conquered and still exist today. That's why the title of the book is Unconquered States, right? Non-European powers in the imperial age, right? So these would be Iran. At that time, it was called Persia, Japan, China, Thailand, Ethiopia, Hawaiian Kingdom, Tonga. What is significant is that Hawaii became an independent state before these non-European powers, right? We became an independent state in 1843. Turkey did not follow until 1850s. So Hawaii was the first one, right? So in this, so the editors of this book, Professor Shehabi from Boston College, University of Boston, School of Diplomacy, and also he's a political scientist, and Professor Moladel from London School of Economics and Political Science, invited me to write the chapter on Hawaii. So when that chapter was submitted, that manuscript was submitted, Oxford University Press is the highest level of academic publishing in the world. Okay? In the world. Their competitor is Cambridge University Press. And what they operate on is what is called a double-blind review, a form of peer review. Okay? So in this case, any manuscript that is submitted to Oxford or Cambridge, but in this case, Oxford assigns it to reviewers that have expertise in certain areas that is covered in the manuscript. So in this case, I cover from Hawaii's history from the death of Captain Cook, the latter part of the 18th century, establishment of the Hawaiian Kingdom as an independent state, government reform, invasion of the Hawaiian Kingdom by Marines in 1893, the overthrow of the Hawaiian government, which was unlawful, which led to the occupation of the Hawaiian Kingdom, and then the restoration of the Hawaiian Kingdom government by a council of regency in 1997. And then I closed the chapter with the Permanent Court of Arbitration. So that was my manuscript. If Hawaii was the 50th state and not the occupied state of the Hawaiian Kingdom, my chapter would not have been published, right? No way. Now, double-blind review works this way. I had at least 4 reviewers. So I would assume political science, law of occupation, international law, and possibly international humanitarian law were the reviewers' background. But I didn't know who they were, and the reviewers didn't know who I was. But we would be communicating, right? Responding, and their job is to poke holes in the manuscript. Well, they didn't poke any holes because they couldn't find any holes. In fact, they even recommended how to make it tighter. You know, they could see the depth of this. This is huge, right? So my chapter got published, and that was December of 2024, which is, you know, that was a major accomplishment that we were able to get while we're in phase 2 called exposure of the occupation. That just took it to the stratosphere. So right there, this is not a conspiracy theory. You know, this has already been published by Oxford, and the fact that the Permanent Court of Arbitration and intergovernmental organization recognize Hawaiian Kingdom's continued existence, and it also includes all those countries that put that Permanent Court of Arbitration in place. These are the signatories. And one in particular country that is a part of the Permanent Court of Arbitration is the United States of America. And they explicitly, not implicitly, explicitly recognize the Hawaiian Kingdom continues to exist and the Council Regency is its government. But what has happened since 1999, you don't hear anything, because if you can't break it, just don't talk about it.
Can you put a finer point on how did they explicitly acknowledge the continued existence of the Hawaiian Kingdom?
Okay, so 2 points to that. One is under international law called opinio juris, which is practice of states, which is part of international law. The other is communication directly with the United States State Department and its embassy in the Netherlands. So before the Permanent Court of Arbitration was going to establish the tribunal comprised of 3 arbitrators, which they did on June 9th, 2000. I spoke with the Secretary General, Van den Hout, who's a Dutch national. This was in February of 2000, right? And he told me over the phone that the Secretariat, which is what they're called, who runs the Permanent Court of Arbitration, can find no evidence that the Hawaiian Kingdom ceases to exist. You notice how we worded that. They found no evidence the kingdom ceases to exist, meaning no treaties. All you have is American laws being imposed, which is the basis of the dispute, right? And then he also acknowledged that the Hawaiian-Dutch Treaty continues to exist because it wasn't terminated, right? So, let me close this. Sorry. So he then made a recommendation to me as the government representing the Hawaiian Kingdom. I was the lead agent. If the government of the Hawaiian Kingdom, with the consent of Lance Larson's counsel, to provide a formal invitation to the United States to join in the arbitration so they can explain how American laws can be imposed in occupied Hawaiian Kingdom, right? So that prompted a meeting for me to have the following month. And I was there with Miss Parks. She was the attorney for Lance Larson. And we had a conference call meeting in Washington, D.C. with John Crook from the U.S. State Department. And in that meeting, first question he poses to me is, and the Permanent Court of Arbitration accepted this case? Because he knew what that meant. Because when you accept the case, you're saying the Hawaiian Kingdom is a state, an independent state. And I said, yes. And I said, the reason for this meeting is that we were advised by the Secretary General to provide the United States a formal invitation to join in the arbitration. And that's when he started to watch his P's and Q's, because he knew that I was going to reduce it to writing. So after the meeting, I put it in writing of what was covered, invitation made, sent him a copy of it for the record, and also copied it to the Permanent Court of Arbitration that the invitation was given. 3 weeks later, I believe 3 weeks, I received a call from Phyllis Hamilton, the Deputy Secretary General, and she's an American. And she says that they have a response that was given by the U.S. the United States to their embassy in The Hague, and that they respectfully declined the invitation to join in the arbitration. Makes sense, because you're walking right into a kill zone. I mean, this is, we're calling the bluff, right? But she said they have a counter offer. They asked permission from the Hawaiian government if they could have access to all records and pleadings of the case, along with the consent of Lance Larson's counsel. And we said, absolutely. So that right there was a mutual agreement for them to have access to the records and pleadings of the case. Now, as far as their recognition explicitly as a matter of international law, every year, the Permanent Court of Arbitrations provides an annual report to the members that form the Permanent Court. Today, it's 125 members, which includes the United States. From 2001 to 2011, every annual report included a list of arbitration cases. And it is listed, the Hawaiian Kingdom is listed as a 33rd case. And with a footnote, it says, the tribunal was established pursuant to Article 47 of the Permanent Court of Arbitration's treaty. Article 47 applies to non-contracting states. Okay. No one disputed or objected to what was done by the Secretariat, right, in their annual reports, especially the United States, because they already entered into an agreement with us. They can't say, oh, no, you're the 50th state. No, you had that chance, right? Because there's no evidence for it. So the practice, so after 2000, the 2011 annual report, from 2012 on, they don't have the annex attached anymore because the Permanent Court of Arbitration lists all the cases on their website. So they don't need to have that as part of the annual report. And if you go to the Permanent Court of Arbitration's website, you look up cases, you'll see Larson versus the Hawaiian Kingdom, and it specifically says the Hawaiian Kingdom in parentheses state, right? So when these countries don't object, they accept as practice the Hawaiian Kingdom is recognized as an independent state. And that's why under international law, they also recognize the Hawaiian Kingdom as an independent state, but also by contract, by agreement, they recognize the Hawaiian Kingdom as an independent state.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And like one of the things that came up for me as you were sort of talking about that is like I was remembering some old interviews you had done that there were two stories that I remember you telling that sort of talked about like how this was starting to filter out into the international relations realm, right? Other ambassadors, other people connected to other countries. I know there was one story you've told about sort of shortly after that case at the Permanent Court of Arbitration, you met with an ambassador or somebody from one of the governments at a restaurant and then talked a little bit about that. But then I also remember another case that there was like a article written by the New York Times years ago, probably 15 plus years ago when I first started researching this, and you had talked about that somebody from the Chinese government also was read in on what had happened at the Permanent Court of Arbitration because they were basically making the comparison when it came to the United States trying to sell China not to take Taiwan, where they consider Taiwan to be part of their territory, that they were saying, hey, like you can't get on us about Taiwan when you're occupying Hawaii, basically. Can you talk about either of those two stories and any other that you might have about sort of like how this is starting to sink in for other people who are actually doing diplomatic relations for countries?
Okay, so let me talk about the Rwandan ambassador, and that occurred December 12th, 2000. So we had oral hearings at The Hague on December 7th, 8th, and 11th, and that was Thursday, Friday, and a Monday, okay? And we not only made it accessible as far as the pleadings and records for the United States, but also for any country that wanted access, including news outlets, whoever, right? We made it open. Okay. We received a call on the last day of the hearing, December 11th, in the evening, from the Permanent Court of Arbitration patching in an ambassador of Rwanda from the embassy in Brussels, Belgium, who was at the Permanent Court, who was at the Peace Palace where the International Court of Justice is, as well as the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Both sit across the hall from each other, right? And he wanted to speak to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Hawaiian Kingdom, and that was Peter Ume'aliloa Sai, your other cousin. Got on the phone, and he says that he has important information to convey to us, and if we could meet him in Brussels, and that he'd be willing to send a motorcade to pick us up. Well, we said, well, we'll catch the train. So we met the ambassador the next day, December 12th, with his motorcade. And we're taken to a meeting that was to be held at a cafe. And this cafe, I found out later, was bought out for a couple hours by Rwanda. So nobody's in there, right? So here we're in the cafe. Windows are closed, right? The shades are closed. And the ambassador is sitting in front of me. I'm the lead agent. And the other members of the Council of Regency are behind me. He tells me that his government in Kigali has reviewed all the records and pleadings of this case from the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and that it is clear Hawaii is occupied, and this cannot be tolerated. And that he said that he has been authorized from the president to the Minister of Foreign Affairs to him that Rwanda is prepared to report to the United Nations General Assembly about the occupation of Hawaii and bring it to an end. Now that quickly made me realize we need a meeting. So I excused myself from the meeting, and the Council of Regency met on the side. We discussed it. I sat back down in front of the ambassador, and I said, please convey to your president our sincere gratitude, but we cannot accept this offer at this time in good conscience, because our people back home have no idea of the status of Hawaii as a country in existence, as an independent state, but occupied. And we couldn't move from one mountain to another mountain when our people back home have no idea what's going on. So I said, we need to go home and address the devastating effects of denationalization. And he said, thank you. And I responded, thank you. And the meeting came to a close, went to the Hague, back to the Hague on the train. Council of Regency had a meeting. And it was decided that since I already have a bachelor's degree from the University of Hawai, and I know what they're teaching, and it's all wrong regarding Hawaii's history, it was decided that I would enter the University of Hawai Political Science Department as a graduate student, there to get a master's degree specializing in international relations and law, and then my PhD, and then start teaching the correct history and spreading it. And that would be part of phase 2, which is the continuation of exposure, right? Now that exposure was specifically chosen because of scholarship, research, peer review, right? Not politics. And we basically were able to break the ceiling open. That led to a plethora of master's theses, PhDs that were done by many students, as well as international students, right? Because Hawaii has a history with a lot of these countries, because we have treaties with the Netherlands, Belgium, Japan, Great Britain, France, Germany, Norway, Sweden, right? Russia. Okay, so there's a treasure chest of information in the archives in other countries, and these students are confirming what we've been saying and putting their work into dissertations. And that, through that exposure, caught the attention of the international community, now through the law of occupation, right? Now through academic publishing, but also rooted in what the Permanent Court of Arbitration already verified. Hawaiian Kingdom still exists.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy that in, essentially 25 years, you've managed to take this conversation from unknown at all, right, to now something that is very much being taught at UH, it's being taught in law schools. What I found really fascinating in one of the videos I was watching was Dr. Lawrence Gonsher was talking about the ways in which the Hawaiian Constitution of 1840 started to sort of proliferate, and the ideas and sort of the structure from some of the ways the system was set up kind of continued to spread throughout the Pacific into other countries. So I thought that was really fascinating. And can you maybe even just highlight kind of like the idea about Hawaii, the Hawaiian Kingdom being a constitutional monarchy, and how big of a deal it was for the Kamehamehas to sort of pass that sort of like power to the people and not to sort of maintain that all vested in themselves?
Well, the one thing that Hawaii had that other Polynesian countries didn't have was a Kamehameha, right? That conquered, not unified. He conquered and consolidated 4 former kingdoms into one with a centralized control under the kapu system called ali'i ana, a form of chiefly administration, which is reflected in Chief of War, right? That is now airing on Apple TV, right? That is a reflection of that time. Very strict, at times brutal, but you had centralized control, right? So when Kamehameha joined the British Empire, there was no competing other kingdom trying to stop him. Like in the case of Samoa, dealing with Malieto, you had other rival chiefs that were still fighting, even in what we call French Polynesia today, right? You had different kingdoms, okay? In Aotearoa, you had different tribes. But in Hawaii, you had a Kamehameha. That is really significant. And through that centralized control, Kamehameha knew and saw the writing on the wall. He had to adjust. That's why he joined the British Empire. And that was our entry into the international arena with a formal relationship with a large empire, which at that time they say, sun never sets on the British Empire, right? That's how vast it was. That led to Hawaii conforming itself to British custom, eventually becoming a constitutional monarchy and one of the most progressive governments in the world at that time. Universal health care for Native Hawaiians at no charge, Queen's Hospital. Native Hawaiians could get land at 50 acres, get 50 acres of land, up to 50 acres of land, government land, at 50 cents an acre, which is $17 today with the inflation calculator. So the issue of land, healthcare, education wasn't a problem. It became a problem when the overthrow occurred in 1893 and we were separated from our rights that exist under Hawaiian Kingdom law till today. But what concealed all of that was denationalization. So our approach entering the University of Hawaii was a way to pierce through the devastating effects of denationalization and begin to restore the national consciousness in the minds of people. We're not asking them to join anything. There's nothing to join. You're in a country, we're occupied. You know, just be better at what you do, but you got to know what's going on. Because the Hawaiian Kingdom government, by its Council of Regency, its duty is to bring compliance and to apply what we call lawfare, not warfare. So we use law as the mechanism to achieve military objectives, in this case, to comply with the law of occupation, FM 27-5, FM 27-10, which have both been superseded by FM 6-27, right? So it's all there. So we don't have to have a discussion about this. No, just comply with the law of occupation. Now, if you don't comply, then you become a subject of a war criminal report. Now you're going to get prosecuted. And so that's where we are now.
I know you talked about that 3-phase plan, that you're in phase 2, which is sort of the letting people know and making people aware of and the exposure of the Hawaiian Kingdom as a continued state. And then phase 3 is sort of this compliance era. I know there's some stuff that you've been working on that had to do with the Maui Police Department as part of this idea of forcing compliance with the laws of occupation. Can you explain a little bit about like what it is that you're working on now in terms of like not focusing on that political discussion, right? But on just kind of really going at the centers of power or the decision makers in the sort of chain of command under the rules of occupation?
Well, because the Hawaiian Kingdom is an independent state, and the members of the family of nations are also independent states, meaning they're separate from each other. We are not going toward a collective approach, but actually we are going toward a decentralized approach where we will talk directly to states themselves and provide them how they're implicated in this. So this is not operating from a political perspective of politics and change. No, this is what happened. Here you're tied to the situation, and here are the consequences for your actions. Do I have your attention? See, that's the approach. So in that sense, you have to find a conduit to that decentralized system of independent states. And that conduit that I made use of, or we, the Council of Regency, made use of, was the legal counsel at the Permanent Court of Arbitration, whose duty was to determine whether or not the Hawaiian Kingdom exists as a state, and that their decision, which they affirmed, affected all the members of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Individually, they can respond and object, but they didn't. So they are individually affected and individually preempted by the fact that the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists. So that is a very different way of thinking than trying to garner support for something, because we're not trying to make political change, which is what movements do. Okay? And that presumes nothing's there. That's why there needs to be something to be done, whether civil rights, right? Anything like that within a country. Here, we're dealing with things that already exist, and this is just non-compliance. So we're going to use war crimes as leverage, because war crimes are not committed by countries. You can't put a country on trial. They're committed by individuals, right? And these individuals have to have not only the act itself, let's say denationalization as a war crime, but they also have to have the accompanying mental element of mens rea to be criminally liable for prosecution. In 2020, the Royal Commission of Inquiry that investigates war crimes in Hawaii requested a legal opinion to be written by one of the renowned experts on international criminal law from Middlesex University, London, Professor William Chavis. And Professor Chavis provided a legal opinion to the Royal Commission of Inquiry, identifying what war crimes are being committed in the Hawaiian Kingdom and the requisite elements that need to be met for criminal prosecution. In order for the person to meet the element of criminal intent or awareness, all that needs to be shown is that the perpetrator was made aware of the factual circumstances that led to the occupation. Okay, now can you see that, how that ties directly to education and exposure? So if I'm a law enforcement officer in Hawaii and I'm enforcing American law, okay, that's a war crime, because that's the imposition of American law called usurpation of sovereignty during occupation, right? But whether or not that law enforcement officer can be held liable for prosecution, they need to be made aware of the factual circumstances that led to the occupation. And that's exactly what happened when I did a presentation for the Maui County Council in 2022. And I explained to them about Hawaii's occupation and war crimes. A police officer saw that YouTube recording of me presenting to a legislative body of the state of Hawaii called the Maui County Council. And he was concerned. So he reached out to the chair, Tamara Polton, and asked if she could give him my contact information, which I previously told Tamara, absolutely, for sure. So he spoke over the phone, and he said he saw the presentation, and he asked, can he be held liable for war crimes? And I said, no, because at that time you weren't aware. But you were committing the war crime, but you weren't aware that it was a war crime, and that you weren't aware of the factual circumstances that led to the occupation. And then he responds back to me and he says, but now I know, because I watched your presentation. I said, exactly. Now you know. So he goes, what should I do? Well, I found out he was one of the directors for detectives. He's a Maui detective. He's the director of detectives in the State of Hawaii Police Union called SHOPO, and in the Maui chapter. And I said, why don't you go set up a presentation for me to give at the Maui chapter in one of their meetings? So he did. And I laid it out, just like what I did at the Maui County Council. And one particular sergeant in the back from Molokai, he says out loud, now we know. Exactly, now you know. So can you see how this leverage can occur just by talking, just by exposing, right? And then that led to Detective Kamuela Hawaii and a patrolman, McAllister, to make a formal request of Chief Pelletier of the Maui County Police Department to request legal services from the Corporation Counsel of the county. Corporation Counsel is like the Attorney General for the county level, to assure them that they're not committing war crimes, because this is America and not the Hawaiian Kingdom. And that legal counsel responded, "Thank you for the letter, but there's no need to do anything." Wait a minute. That was a complete aversion from what was requested formally by the chief of police. So it's something that nobody wants to touch because they know what they're going to see and they know what's going to happen. So that eventually led to Senator Cross Makani Crab last September, who was apprised of he committing war crimes by passing American law in the state of Hawaii legislature, and he's implicated. And in order to alleviate that criminal intent, he wrote a formal letter to the Attorney General of the state of Hawaii, Ann Lopez, because he's been made aware of the law of occupation and war crimes being committed in Hawaii, and he is in possession of 2 legal opinions from international scholars about Hawaii being occupied, for the Attorney General to assure him that war crimes are not being committed and that the state of Hawaii exists within the United States and it doesn't exist within the Hawaiian Kingdom. She's been sitting on that for 8 months, well, since September. In June, that's what led this detective, who is now vice chair of the police union, Shopo, for the Maui chapter, to retain an attorney. His name is Edward Halealo Ayao, legal representation to address this with the Attorney General. And June 3rd, a letter was sent to the Attorney General by this attorney, basically demanding her to provide or make public that the legal opinion that was requested by the former senator, and that she has until June 11th, which is a national holiday in the kingdom, Kamehameha Day. And no response, still no response. And that is what prompted Detective Hawaii, by a letter by his attorney to the senior Army National Guard officer who has the responsibility to transition the state of Hawaii into a military government, said that he's now operating under the laws of the Hawaiian Kingdom, including those provisional laws, which the Council of Regency proclaimed in 2014, because we've got to bring the 1893 laws up to date. And in that proclamation, we exercise our legislative authority by stating all federal, state, county laws will be the provisional laws of the Hawaiian Kingdom so long as they do not run contrary to the letter, spirit, and intent of Hawaiian Kingdom law. So the police department is consistent with Hawaiian Kingdom law. Majority of the laws in Hawaii are consistent, meaning the Hawaiian Kingdom would have enacted those laws anyway through a legislature. But a law that would be inconsistent would be IRS, Internal Revenue Service, because that is a tax collecting arm of the United States. No, you cannot collect taxes from people in occupied territory. But the state of Hawaii laws on taxes are consistent. So kind of that's what prompted law enforcement to do what they're doing.
So, I mean, is it safe to say that like all of the Maui Police Department is actually aware of this now?
Are they what? Was the question?
I was just saying, like, is it fair to say that all of the Maui Police Department is now aware of this? It seems like they probably talk. It's probably not a secret, huh?
Yeah, so I don't know that I can qualify that unless I know that for sure. But I know everybody's talking, and it's on the news. It's it's everywhere, right? And remember, all it is that you were made aware of the factual circumstances that led to the occupation. You don't need a legal opinion. No, you just got to be made aware, right? So that is a means by which to use lawfare to achieve the objective of compliance to the law of occupation. And we are now also in communication. An intergovernmental organization that I'm not going to mention who received our diplomat as a special envoy to be a part of their assembly, right? And right now, their legal counsel is performing the very same duty that the legal counsel of the Permanent Court of Arbitration did in determining that the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists as a state. What adds to this credibility of our existence is that 110 members of the Permanent Court of Arbitration are also members of this intergovernmental organization where they already recognize the Hawaiian Kingdom as an independent state. And then we also have things in motion regarding at the United Nations level. But we couldn't get to this point without a solid foundation of research, publications, actions. So you can see that we're not begging for anything. This is a very affirmative approach, meaning a response approach where you walk into the fire, but we make sure that we have an asbestos suit on as we're walking into that fire. And that asbestos suit is called the law, and that law protects us.
A couple more things I want to ask real quick is, like, as we're heading into this phase 3 and the idea that we will one day see the Hawaiian Kingdom government restored, I know one of the things you've talked about is the idea of, like, we kind of got to do a study to figure out, like, what was the actual economic impact of 130 years of illegal occupation? What would reparations look like being paid back to the country? Can you talk a little bit about, like, what does life look like after the restoration or during this sort of, like, the swap over of the government?
Okay, so I got to correct you there, Kaliko. It's not restoring the government because it's already restored. That's us. That's how we got to the Hague, right? And that's why we're able to do what we're doing. So the issue is not restoring anything, right? We're not restoring the country. We're not restoring the government. We're bringing compliance to the law of occupation is the key. And that compliance to the law of occupation, which is the administration of the laws of the occupied state, which includes those provisional laws that is recognized, federal, state, county laws, enacted after 1893 to the present. Those are provisional laws, but also what also is included is the economy. So the Hawaiian Kingdom, in international relations, we call it political economy, right? So the political economy of Hawaii is capitalism, but not based on Adam Smith's version of Wealth of Nations, right? Those are different rules that apply. A sense of laissez-faire, let the market regulate. Our political economy was specifically adopted and taught stemming from Francis Whalen's political economy from Brown University. And his approach toward this political economy, which is a type of welfare state, where the government looks out for the welfare of its people, education, right? Healthcare, land. It is based on capitalism, but it's infused with Christian values. How's that? That's like an oxymoron with Adam Smith's version, right? But the Hawaiian Kingdom was already Protestant, right? Full on. So it was something they could understand. So the Hawaiian economy is very similar to the political economies of the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, these Scandinavian countries. So you have heavy taxes, but you have a lot of benefits. In order to have heavy taxes, you have to have a booming employment, right? Workers. That's what existed in the Hawaiian Kingdom. But once the United States took over, they not only imposed their laws, but they also imposed their version of capitalism. And that has led to a lot of problems today for Native Hawaiians who comprise the majority of the national population of citizenry of the occupied state, the Hawaiian Kingdom.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up because I heard you mention that in one of your other lectures, and that was a new thing for me, that this idea of, like, there was not an antithesis, but an alternative to the Adam Smith Wealth of Nations sort of viewpoint, and that, like, they actually took that time to actually think about functionally how they wanted to set up an economy, and obviously having sort of their I would say the ancient ways of kind of getting resources out to people. It would make sense that what they ended up putting out was similar to that in some ways, but focused on the welfare of the people and not on sort of like the individual collective, collecting as much as you can as an individual and not worrying about everybody around you.
So it was a very Polynesian approach, very familiar approach, right, toward governance. You know, the role of parents, makua, the children, kamali'i, the brothers, sisters, kaikaina, right? Kaikuana. So you see that in the system because that's how they thought, right? But that's not how we think today, because we've been brainwashed into believing something that's not true. And in our mindsets, even though I may say I'm Hawaiian, I have an American national consciousness because that's all I knew. So for myself and the other members of the Council of Regency and the government of the occupied state, we had to first address that denationalization effect in our own selves and come to terms before we start walking it. So it's a process of restoring national consciousness, right? But what is happening now in the schools throughout Hawaii, the grade schools, that's not restoring national consciousness. That's called teaching national consciousness. And that's Hawaiian national consciousness. Because at the university, when teachers are getting their teacher certificate to teach, they're also taking a lot of our classes up there, So they know that Hawaii is occupied and they're starting to teach it. So I'm working with public schools today. In fact, I gave a presentation to 2 public schools a couple weeks ago about national consciousness, and they are totally on board because they can't deny it, and they've already learned it. Now, how do you implement it in curriculum development? So that's where you really get into that nitty-gritty aspect of complying with the law of occupation. It's not just the United States and the state of Hawaii, but also our own people need to comply, and they need to know what actually happened. So I cover that point of Hawaii's political economy in my Oxford University Press chapter. So I would recommend your audience to go download that PDF, and that right there lays it out as far as what the Hawaiian Kingdom was from the latter part of the 18th century to what it currently is as an occupied state.
Yeah, I'll definitely make sure I link that in the show notes so people can download the PDF, because it is fascinating. It's like 33 pages, but I took the time to read it yesterday, and I did learn several new things throughout the pages of that. Right before we wrap up here, there was one more question I wanted to ask. I know obviously you're focused on the nuts and bolts of the legal arguments and getting the actual laws of occupation complied to, but we're also kind of now living through what is seemingly like a big cultural moment for a lot of Hawaiians with this new Chief of War series coming out on Apple TV. It talks about sort of Ka'iana, but the rise of Kamehameha and the prophecy that was told before his sort of birth about sort of how this one chief was going to unite the islands. And so I'm just kind of curious, what are your overall thoughts about this sort of cultural moment? You're talking about sort of restoring the national consciousness. This isn't necessarily talking about the nation yet, but it is getting back to really kind of uncovering things that, even as someone who lives in diaspora, right, who's Native Hawaiian but not like living in Hawaii, like how are you taking this moment, and how do you sort of see that for the work that you do in terms of lifting the consciousness of like what came before 1959 or 1898?
Well, for me, I have a direct role because I'm faculty at the University of Hawaii, so we teach this stuff, right, and I can control that. But I do work with others in the community that reach out to me, or I may reach out to them if there's a mutual goal that we both may want to achieve, right? So in the case of Chief of War, myself and Kogi, our cousin, we were up at Mauna Kea. That was when the protests were occurring up there. And Pa'a actually was trying to find us because he wanted to speak to us, because he knew that he knew that we were the ones that were spoken of as far as who knows the history of Hawaii, right? Because of what we do. And that's what led to Jason showing up, but I missed that part of the meeting because I was called to another meeting, and a picture was taken, right? And it was Wiki Tutu as well as Koei,
yep,
and Jason Momoa and Paul. And they were explaining how they were in the process of developing a film series on Ka'iana, right? For Netflix, I thought they said at that time, which eventually is now on Apple TV. And they wanted to make sure that it was historically accurate. in what they do. Now, naturally, it's going to be Hollywood. So what you see in Chief of War, the names, the positions, and everything, historically accurate. The events, historically accurate. But the twist on who does what, that's part of Hollywood. And I got to admit, I watched those 2 first episodes and I was blown away because I know the history. And I'm like, that is awesome the way they twisted that to turn it. It's like creating a Hawaiian Game of Thrones, right?
Yeah.
That was powerful.
I felt like even the intro that they had with sort of the Olis kicking it off and sort of like the rolling hills where it's got the feather work coming in. It felt very Game of Thrones, very epic. And I think like, the Hawaiian history is one of very epic stories. So it's cool to finally see that on that kind of a platform.
So what I was told was that they were hoping that this would be a blockbuster so that Apple TV will continue additional seasons, because what they want to do is to continue the narrative up to the establishment of the Hawaiian Kingdom government, the monarchs, Lord Paulette, and what happened in 1843, because you still had those events of not political, but dangerous events taking place even during the Kingdom era, gunboat diplomacy, and that's where they want to take it. So that process, I firmly believe, is in response to the exposure of this information that we started when we returned from the Netherlands. Because Kauai, she's now the director of Hawaii Ulu, where they have access to all newspapers, PDFs, a treasure trove of information. That is her specialty. Also the language, right? For me, mine is academic research, the law, right? But together, it's part of phase 2, the exposure. And Chief of War, I can say, without a doubt, is a product of that, right? Because we were sought out by Pa'a, one of the co-producers with Jason Momoa, because of our work that was done. So that's pretty cool. And then to see my nephews who are acting in this, in episode 3, Iowane, oh, that was mind blowing, and wow, the level of perfection, right? And also what is being done behind the scenes, where my nephew Keawe is the language coach. Okay, so that was his job and responsibility. So what I tell people when they ask me, what should I do? Well, you don't need to replicate what others do. Like, don't try to be like me, but just maximize your kuleana. So for your audience, kuleana means responsibility in Hawaiian. So whoever you are, be the best at it. If you're a teacher in the school, be the best teacher that you can be, and ensure that you're teaching accurate information. If you're a police officer, like my son, Kapua, be the best police officer you can be. If you're Iowane, an actor, film actor, be the best actor you can be, right? So for you with your podcast, maximize your kuleana, be the best podcaster you can be. So through that process, the idea of the Hawaiian Kingdom as a country is an acceptance of a reality that people didn't know before. It's not where you go hold up signs and you rally. No, you just stay home and take care of your family and do what you got to do. And the Council of the Regency, we have to do what we have to do, because our job is to bring compliance. And we're on that road, and it's going to happen soon, very soon.
Well, I appreciate you embracing and taking on your kuleana over the years and helping to inspire others to take on theirs. And I think that's definitely part of the idea behind Kaliko Vision here, is for all of us in our own individual lives to figure out what is it that's our specific, unique skill set that makes us special, that we can offer to the world and outside of the Hawaiian Kingdom and sort of inside this sort of conversation as well. But I think, I've considered my kuleana to be American politics, right? And the idea that like I can start to socialize this through the elected officials that I work with and through the people that I know inside the American government and inside the American system and American voters. Because ultimately, even though the law of compliance will be complied irrespective of how Americans feel about it, it would sure be helpful if people understood the history of how we got to this place, how we owe and have some responsibility as Americans also to what happened in Hawaii, right? And so this isn't just about Hawaiians fighting for recognition that has always been there and should have always been there, but about Americans also standing up for what we say are our principles, right, of self-determination, of making sure that we're standing up for the underdog, and ultimately standing up for the rule of law. And I think in this era, when we're living through American fascism, watching institutions be torn down, and the Trump administration just kind of give a big middle finger to the rule of law, I think things like this conversation are every bit as important, because it speaks as much to American values as it speaks to sort of the perpetuation of the Hawaiian Kingdom.
So I believe that what is important for Hawaiians that are living in America, because you're in a foreign country, okay? You're not in occupied territory. You're in the United States of America. Hawaii is occupied territory. So the law of occupation applies here, which is to administer the laws of the occupied state. But Hawaiians that are in America, they all need to know their rights as a Hawaiian subject. They could also be an American by birth, not a problem with that, but dual citizen. So an important document that all Hawaiians in America or any country where they reside, they need to know their rights under the treaty and rights under international law. So the United States entered into a treaty of friendship, commerce, and navigation with the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1849. And that specifically states what rights Hawaiians have in America and what rights Americans have in the Hawaiian Kingdom. So I would provide a link to that treaty so that a lot of people can start reading that, because that would apply to you folks there. The treaty with the United States wouldn't apply really for us here unless through me as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, if I'm going to do something with it, right? But that treaty is the base of your connection to the Hawaiian Kingdom as a Hawaiian subject. So yeah, I would recommend everybody take a read of that.
I would definitely link that in the show notes as well. And I hadn't yet made that connection in my head, that lineage will lead to sort of like the Hawaiian subject side of things and it being a potential dual citizenship situation, but also that it would come under that 1849 treaty.
Right.
So I'll definitely link that up. I hope this will be the first of many conversations we can have on this podcast, but I very much appreciate you making yourself available for me in just the second episode of this relaunch. I'm really excited to get this information out to, my network and to my community. And I'm sure there will be a lot of questions that will come from that. But once again, I appreciate all the work that you continue to do to uplift sort of the history of the people and the history of the country, and to continuing to be a Hawaiian patriot and teaching others what that means. So thank you so much for joining us, Keanu. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. Appreciate it, Kaliko.
And appreciate everyone listening to another episode of Kaliko Vision. We'll be sure to be back next week with another awesome guest. But until next time, aloha.